Hello everyone. My name's Mark Cully and I'm going to be chairing this session. Let me introduce my fellow panellists and make some remarks about our constitution. This session is called Blame the Economists, Not the Economy. And just to be clear on that, there are two economists up here. Myself, I'm the chief economist for the Department of Immigration and Citizenship in Canberra. And also from Canberra, Richard Dennis, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Institute and something of a professional ratbag. Neither of us, I think, would want to be seen as having apportioned any blame for the current crisis, but we'll get onto that. And we're joined by two non-economists, both of them from overseas. And both, I think, can therefore offer a useful perspective on this issue, particularly, I think, given myself and Richard's perspective, we're mostly around Australia and around what's happened in the developed world, but we have two people here who can offer us a perspective on how this crisis is unfolding in the developing world. On my immediate right, Dr. Khalid Koser, who's from the Centre for Security Policy in Geneva and is a geographer by trade, with a particular specialism in looking at the movement of people in developing countries around the world. And next to him is Mr. M.C. Mehta, who is a member of an attorney in the Supreme Court of India and is an environmental lawyer. And I think one of the real issues that economists are contending with, in fact, one of the issues that Richard's Centre has done some terrific work in, is trying to think about how do we bring the notion of the environment within the purview of economics, and how do we think about a sustainable economics. And I think Richard spoke yesterday about the notion of green capitalism. So the way we're going to run this particular session is that I'm going to start off with a few preliminaries. I'm a kind of participating chair. I have to be a little bit coy about what I say, being a public servant. So I'm going to set a few preliminary remarks. I'm going to throw to Richard, then to Khalid, and then to Mr. Mehta. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves and then take some questions from people out here. And I guess my first, if I'm reflecting about this event, which people are using a variety of terms to call, it seems to be the fact that most governments around the world are calling it the global financial crisis. And they do that for two reasons. One is because it's global, it's out there, it's not our fault. And they call it the financial crisis because its locus, I think it's true to say, its locus was in the financial sphere, but it's also the case that the governments can then say it's not our fault, it's the fault of the banks or what have you. But if I think about the global financial crisis, and I'll just use that for shorthand, there are a number of distinguishing features about it. But in a sense, what is interesting, at least from an Australian perspective, is the fact that we haven't had a recession since the very early 1990s. And a recession is a regular, recurring feature of capitalist economies. It has been for a very, very long time. And I can remember, at least in my lifetime, we had a recession in the mid-1970s due to the OPEC oil shock. We had a recession in the very early 1980s, which we might characterise as a kind of cost-push inflation blowout. And we had a recession in the early 1990s that was caused by very high interest rates that were set. And in a sense, what's unusual about the last couple of decades is that we'd become almost inured to the idea that recessions were possible. And in fact, you may say there's a degree of complacency amongst policymakers and amongst economists about having developed policy tools as a means of regulating the economy to avoid going into deep recessions. And this is probably most exemplified by Ben Bernanke, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, the equivalent of Glenn Stevens here in Australia, who, before he took up his post, before he succeeded Alan Greenspan, gave a famous speech. It is now famous. It was quite widely cited at the time, called The Great Moderation. And he argued in this speech that economists and policymakers had worked out how to avoid capitalist economies going into deep recessions. So he obviously got that one wrong. Now, there is a line, and it's a rather brutal line, but there is nonetheless a line that economists use going right back to the days of Joseph Schumpeter, that recessions are part of the process of creative destruction. And you saw that echoed, in fact, in the last recession that Australia had, when Prime Minister Keating was famously said, and it came back to bite him quite severely, that this is the recession that we had to have. So there is a sense in which recessions can be cathartic. Now, it seems to me there still is a question to be asked about whether this particular global financial crisis, at least as it's playing out in Australia, is in fact really a crisis. And I think if you're sitting in a secure job and you've got a mortgage to pay and you're some way off retirement, you might well be wondering what the fuss is about. You've got very low interest rates, you've got reductions in fuel prices, and you've got the government handing out stimulus payments, direct cash payments to you, enabling people to go out and buy their plasma televisions. This is the plasma television-led recovery. And you may well be wondering what the fuss is about. But even standing back from that, I think there is a question yet to be answered about whether this is really an epochal event, or is it something that we will ride out. And it must be said, I think, at the moment that Australia is faring extremely well relative to other countries in the developed world. And I wait to hear from my friends here about how this is playing out in the developing world. But certainly in terms of the developed world, Australia is riding out this crisis in pretty good fashion. If I go to the title of this, clearly the organisers of the programme are having a little bit of fun at the expense of economists. But there is a serious point to be made, and seeing that I'm the first on, I'll be the first to use this quote. There is a very famous quote that gets used from time to time, and from John Maynard Keynes, who it's very much back in fashion at the moment. And right in the very last chapter of the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, I think I got the order right, Keynes says, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority, that's the government, who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And I think the organisers of the programme very much had that kind of quote in their mind when they framed this session. Now, there are a number of things that you might want to blame economists for in respect of this global financial crisis, and I suspect Richard will touch on them. One is inability to forecast accurately. And economists are very bad, particularly at picking turning points in where an economy's got to, and they might be put in the dock for that, and whether it's fair for them to be done so or not, maybe we'll hear a bit from Richard about that. The second one is the degree of complacency, and I think I made reference to that speech that Ben Bernanke made about the Great Moderation, and in a sense, less attention, you might argue, has been paid to macroeconomics by the economics profession than ought to have been the case. And moving on to that, I guess the third point might be for those who really kind of dwell into and look at the intricacies of economics, the inattention to what you might call real-world economics, where economists seem to either fall into one of two camps. One is an excessive degree of formalism and using mathematics and playing with very abstract models, which sometimes is called physics envy, or indulging in what you might consider to be kind of whimsical research of the kind that I guess the Freakonomics kind of genre of book really exemplifies, where people are putting their talents to look at, really rather indulge in exercises rather than looking at real-world economics and how it bites on people. But I wonder whether it's just too pat to blame economists. Yesterday, I didn't go to it, but I gather there was a very entertaining session on greed. And I wonder to what extent people might use economists as scapegoats when really we ought to be looking a bit more at ourselves and the way in which we've gorged ourselves on debt and speculating on rising house prices and a rising stock market. Alternatively, rather than the economists, we might want to blame the financial whiz kids on Wall Street. And I think they're probably more lawyers and accountants that make up that cohort of financial wizardry rather than economists. Or indeed, one might want to, and I don't know to what extent they are economists or not, look at the role of regulators and whether we've been too lax, particularly the regulators of financial institutions in the United States, I should say, and again the extent to which their laxity was informed by economic theories about the perfectibility of markets or not. That's the backdrop. Hopefully that's given enough context for you to maybe I'll pass over to Richard now, who'll probably say a little bit about Australia and give a little bit of I suspect, an insider's perspective on economics.
Thanks, Mark. As a professional ratbag, economics or economists, I would argue, have become the witch doctors of modern society. They are the small group of high priests who we turn to both for direction and for excuses. And if you understand your ancient history well, or I don't know enough, I don't claim myself to be an expert, but if you understand a little bit about ancient cultures and how witch doctors and high priests, depending on the culture you're looking at, if you understand their role was that of the sycophant. That is, they worked for the king or whoever was actually in charge, and they provided an excuse. They provided a narrative. They provided a cosmic or theological explanation to do exactly what those in power wanted to do. That's what economists do. John Howard was not an economist. Peter Costello was not an economist. Kevin Rudd is not an economist. Economists have not, do not, and will not ever run Australia.
John Hewson?
John Hewson was an economist who was a spectacularly unsuccessful politician. The claim that economists run the country is a very convenient excuse for those who do. Because when you say to the Prime Minister, I want you to tackle climate change, I'm serious, I'm worried for my children, I want you to tackle climate change, he says, and so do I. But the economists say we really shouldn't. When you say Prime Minister, any Prime Minister, Labor or Liberal, I think that the banks are robbing me blind. I want you to regulate, and so do I. I would love to regulate those banks, but you know what the economists say? We can't do it. Once upon a time, the high priests would rip the chicken open in front of the assembled masses and peer into the guts of the chicken and find the spot on the liver, which, as luck would have it, would assure us it was time to go to war. And that you, my army, are going to go and risk your life. Because, in fact, it's the gods that are telling us it's a great time for war. And as I said, all good high priests and all good witch doctors knew that that chicken gut better pretty much tell them exactly what the guy that's really running the show wanted those chicken guts to say. So economists perform an incredible function in concealing in a democracy the way decisions are really made. They allow people to agree with you while doing nothing that you want. For those who were here for the last session, I talked about, the idea that, always be afraid of people who agree with you in principle. Oh, no, I agree. Yeah, those markets are bad, but we'll be sticking with them. All right? Agreeing in principle in politics is a very easy way to just shift, to move people along. And economists, unfortunately, have willingly allowed themselves to be used in such a way. And, while I'm critical of the economics profession, there are great economists in Australia around the world who speak up. Excuse me. That was one of them trying to get their voice heard. But unfortunately, we're talking about global financial crisis. Well, in politics there's a saying, never let a crisis go to waste. All right, we love the GFC. It's a great excuse to not tackle climate change. We love the GFC. It's a great excuse to not spend money on Indigenous health. Oh, I'd love to. I agree in principle. But now is not quite the time. So, look, I think economists collectively need to hang their heads in shame. On their behalf, I'll debase myself before you today. You can direct as much vitriol as you would like at me. But look, the problem is, the economists that you hear the most from are not the good economists that do actually have interesting things to say, whose forecasts and whose knowledge are worth paying attention to, who make simple truths, like Mark said before, that these things called recessions actually show up every 7 years. We get surprised by every one of them. All right, and the miracle in Australia, the economic miracle, is we missed one recession. And that's why, truly, and that's why it's 15 years since our last recession, a little bit more. That's just 2 business cycles. We missed one, we were due for this one, we got it. So there are plenty of good economists out there saying plenty of good things. But I fear most of what you hear is from Craig James from ComSec telling you what happened to the Nikkei Dow today. And I put it to you that anyone that needs to know what happened to the Nikkei Dow today is not tuning into the Channel 10 News to find out about it. Right. What the hell is that doing on our news every night? Well, what it's telling you is that important things that you don't understand are happening, and in fact, that's the reason you can't have all the things you want. It bookends the news. Oh, health, education, fine, but before we end for tonight, the market said it was a good day. The market said it was a bad day. Let's not offend the gods. All right? They're the witch doctors. Offend them. So, we'll be having plenty of time for Q&A. Shameless plug for the Australia Institute, because I'm not on with Craig James every night. If you want to hear from economists that don't think the world revolves around economics, give me your email address.
I told you he was a rat bag. So, look, there are a number of issues there which I want to pick up in some panel discussion with Richard there, because I think he's probably he's probably gone a little bit over the top. I do want to hear his views on who the better economists are in Australia, where they're hiding, so I can hire some of them. And I think there's a serious discussion to be had about the extent to which economists do good, and the extent to which the market does good. And we might pick up some of those discussions. But let me move over to Khalid Koser for his perspective on this question.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. Let me just make 3 preliminary comments. Firstly, I trained many years ago as an undergraduate as a geographer and spent my time being bullied by economists for not doing a serious subject. So it's very nice to be on a panel where economists are taking the flak for once. Secondly, just to reinforce what Mark said, I've spent a lot of time recently in the UK and the USA, and the recession is visible there, and I found it not particularly visible in Australia. So it seems Australia really is riding this out, and perhaps it's not as big a crisis in this country as I think it is in many other parts of the world. And I think thirdly, just to reiterate something said there, Gordon Brown, apparently a very able economist, a very able Chancellor of the Exchequer, absolutely devastatingly terrible Prime Minister. So I think that probably tells us something about the truism of what you just said. I want to spend a few minutes just focusing our attention on the impact of the global financial crisis on the very least developed countries in the world, the poorest parts of the world. I think we're only just beginning to see the impact in those parts of the world, and mainly I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And I think potentially this is an epochal event. This is an event that's going to transform, for the worse, many countries in those parts of the world. I'm not here to blame the economy. I'm not here to blame economists, but I think I am here to blame the current development paradigm, the current development model that allows the world to be in the situation it is at the moment. I think I'd argue the global financial crisis isn't simply a failure of the financial system, lax financial regulation, misunderstood financial innovations, outrageous financial incentives. I think I'd argue it's rooted in the contradictions of the current development trajectory or model. This is the development model which has resulted in the richest 1% of the world receiving as much as the poorest 57% of the world. This is a development model which has resulted in the poorest 40% of the world receiving just 5% of the world's income. This is the development model which has created no world middle class at all. Only 17% of the world's population earns between 75 and 125% of the world's median income. There is no global middle class to speak of. And finally, it's a development model which has, I think, resulted in a globalization of expectations without a globalization of opportunity. What this means is that the very poorest parts of the world, the very poorest people, the least developed countries, are particularly ill prepared to weather the shock of the global financial crisis. And I think it's only just beginning to be felt in those countries. A few figures just to illustrate that. Exports from the African continent have halved between 2008 and 2009, from something like $630 billion to about $300 billion, a halving of export from the African continent. Remittances to the least developed countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are down significantly. The World Bank is forecasting somewhere in the region of 6% reduction in remittances. That may sound trivial to many of us here. Don't forget that household incomes in Somaliland are doubled each year by remittances. Household remittances in Lesotho are added to by 80% a year as a result of remittances. If remittances reduce in these sorts of countries, then entire national economies, households and individuals are going to suffer, I think, very significantly. Foreign direct investment is down in sub-Saharan Africa. Humanitarian assistance is under risk, especially to NGOs. There are all sorts of, I think, direct impacts that the global financial crisis is having on these parts of the world. It's compounded, of course, by falling commodity prices, by rising fuel prices, by rising food prices going up again, and of course in the not too distant future by the effects of climate change too. So it really is a compounding of adverse effects. Unlike, say, the Asia crisis of 1998, which came at the end of 10 years basically of growth, this is coming on top of some really rather adverse effects that are already impacting on many poor parts of the world. If you look at the projections from the UN, the crisis is also going to have a longer-term impact in the very poorest parts of the world. The projection basically is for a V in the developed economies, a dip, then an immediate recovery. It's more or less for a U shape in emerging economies, so a dip, a bit of a time at the bottom, then back up again. The nightmare scenario is an L shape for the poorest parts of the world, down and then staying down. And there are indications that may be taking place, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. What are the consequences? We already in this world have, this is the number of people living on less than $1 a day, 1.18 billion people in the world today already. This is the development model I was speaking about. It's estimated that the global financial crisis will add another 55 million people to the rank of the absolute poor in the world today. It's estimated by the UN that 500,000 more babies will die this year than died last year as a direct result of the global financial crisis. 50 million more people will lose their jobs, mainly in the poor world, as a result of the financial crisis. And 3/4 of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that's about 40 countries in total, will see a rise in extreme poverty in those countries during the year 2009. It would take just a 10% increase in food prices, and that's by no means something that's inconceivable, a 10% increase in food prices to add a further 105 million people to the global poverty level at the moment, to poverty around the world. These effects are impacting in particular the young, the old, displaced, ethnic minorities, the disabled. And I think really significantly, and this is why I might suggest it's an epochal event, we really risk reversing 7 years of poverty reduction around the world. I think this financial crisis risks doing away with the very good work that's taken place over the last 7 to 10 years in terms of poverty reduction. A few final comments from me on the responses that are required, and clearly the fundamental responses about the development paradigm. We need national level responses, especially in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We need to develop productive capacities. We need to expand productive employment. We need to build knowledge systems, training, education, particularly to take advantage of technology. And of course, we need to get rid of corruption, and I wouldn't underestimate the importance of corruption. At a regional level, we need to facilitate, I think, regional investment flows and labour mobility. And clearly, at a global level, we need to think seriously about aid. I gather the G8 has just committed $20 billion over the next 3 years for food aid. That still isn't reaching the targets they made in Gleneagles in 2005 to double overseas development aid. We need a debt moratorium. We need to try to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. We're nowhere near on track for that at the moment. And I think we probably need a stronger voice for the very poorest, and especially Africa, in the international forum in general. Thank you.
Thank you.